China and Russia are today politically closer than they have ever been in history. This was symbolically illustrated this September when Russian President Vladimir Putin traveled to Beijing to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping and to attend an event celebrating the 80th anniversary of their victory in World War II. And many other prominent leaders of the Global South also attended, including the heads of state of Indonesia and Vietnam and Iran, and even Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. The images of these leaders standing together was a clear message to the West. The geopolitical order is changing. The years of Western domination have ended. And at the core of the new multipolar world order that is being built is the close partnership between China and Russia. This is very distressing to the US government because the stated policy in Washington is to try to maintain global dominance to prevent the emergence of what the US calls near-peer strategic competitors. And the US military is very concerned because there are now two near-peer competitors in the world, and they are closely partnered together. That is China and Russia. This is precisely why the Donald Trump administration has put a lot of energy in trying to divide Russia and China, trying to woo Moscow in order to isolate Beijing. Just a few days before the 2024 presidential election that Trump won, he pledged that he would divide Russia and China.
You never want Russia and China uniting. We united them. It's a shame. The stupidity of what they've done. Well, I'm going to have to ununite them, and I think I can do that too. I have to ununite them.
This is Washington's divide and conquer strategy, and it explains why in February 2025, just a few weeks after Trump returned for his second term as U.S. president, he sent top U.S. officials to Saudi Arabia to hold talks with Russia, and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio proposed that the U.S. should try to partner with Russia.
The credible opportunities that exist to partner with the Russians geopolitically on issues of common interest and frankly economically.
Now, when some people heard those remarks from the U.S. Secretary of State, they said, wow, the Trump administration is trying to pursue peace. But this is not about peace. This is a cynical imperial strategy of divide and conquer. The real goal of the U.S. is to try to improve relations with Russia in order to break the close partnership between Moscow and Beijing. And Marco Rubio, who is a lifelong neoconservative war hawk who has supported every single U.S. war, he let the cat out of the bag in his Senate confirmation hearing, where he said very clearly that China is the biggest so-called threat to the U.S. empire ever, and that everything in the 21st century is going to revolve around the U.S. attempt to isolate and destabilize China.
The Communist Party of China leads the PRC, is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. They have elements that the Soviet Union never possessed. They are a technological adversary and competitor, an industrial competitor, an economic competitor, a geopolitical competitor, a scientific competitor now, in every realm. It's an extraordinary challenge. It's one that I believe will define the 21st century. When they write the book about the 21st century, there's going to be some chapters in there about Putin. There's going to be some chapters in there about some of these other places. But the bulk of that book about the 21st century will be not just about China, but about the relationship between China and the United States and what direction it went.
Now, Donald Trump was very confident that he could divide China and Russia, but his strategy was simply implausible from the very beginning. I already talked about how today, in the 2020s, China and Russia are closer politically than they have ever been in history. China's President Xi took a symbolic trip to Moscow in May, and he was Putin's guest of honor as they celebrated the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany in World War II. During this trip, Xi and Putin signed dozens of agreements, and they published a joint statement that was more than 8,000 words long, in which they emphasized that, quote, China-Russia relations have reached the highest level in history, end quote, and they vowed to, quote, jointly resist any attempts to interfere with and disrupt the traditional friendship and deep mutual trust between China and Russia, end quote. So politically, the idea that Trump could somehow do a 180 in U.S. foreign policy and ally with Russia against China was completely absurd from the very beginning. And economically, this idea makes even less sense because China is Russia's largest trading partner by far. China is extremely important to the Russian economy. Over 30% of Russia's exports go to China, and over 1/3 of Russia's imports come from China. And China and Russia have very complementary economies. China is the world's manufacturing superpower, and Russia is the world's commodities superpower. Russia is one of the world's top producers of oil and natural gas, many strategic minerals, grains, and fertilizer. And if you look at what Russia exports to China, it's many of those strategic commodities that China needs as a massive country with 1.4 billion people. That's a lot of mouths to feed. The US, on the other hand, does very little trade with Russia. And in fact, Russia and the US are competitors in many sectors because the US, like Russia, is also one of the world's leading producers of oil and natural gas and grains and many other agricultural goods and meat. If you look at what the US exports, the US does export some technologies and some consumer goods, but a lot of US exports also consist of major commodities like oil. So the US is actually competing with Russia. And what would the US sell to Russia that Russia doesn't already have? I mean, Trump could try to force Russia to buy US cars, Ford and GM cars. But I don't think Russians want US cars. They're happy with Chinese cars and Japanese cars and Korean cars and Russian cars. So both politically and economically, it does not make sense for Russia to ally with the US against China, considering that, again, China is Russia's largest trading partner and Russia's neighbor. Trump simply doesn't have anything that he can offer Russia other than sanctions relief, which Russia cannot even have confidence in anyway, because when Trump eventually leaves office, whoever the next US president is, they could simply reimpose sanctions on Russia. So why would Moscow sacrifice its relations with its most important partner on behalf of Washington? It doesn't make sense. So this is why Russian President Putin has been making it very clear to Trump that the US should not even bother trying to divide China and Russia. This was one of the obvious takeaways of Putin's trip to Beijing this September. And I want to talk more about this trip and the historic event that was held on the 3rd of September, marking the 80th anniversary of the victory over the Japanese Empire in World War II. I talked about the very symbolic photos that were published showing the Chinese President Xi, the Russian President Putin, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and also leaders of many other important Global South countries, including the leaders of Indonesia and Vietnam and Iran and Kazakhstan and other Central Asian republics. There were also Latin American leaders and representatives from Cuba and Nicaragua, and also African representatives. This was a clear display of Global South unity symbolically against Western imperialism and fascism. And the Financial Times, the major Western newspaper, I think it did put it well when it said that this event, this massive military parade in which China's leader Xi was surrounded by many important leaders from the Global South, what this showed is that China is part of an attempt to reshape the world order, to create a more multipolar world. Now, in another video, which I will link to in the description below, I talked about how India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi also visited China in order to attend the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And this was also deeply symbolic because the US government has for decades tried to divide China and India in order to isolate Beijing. But as I explained, Donald Trump has ironically undone a lot of those efforts by constantly attacking India and imposing 50% tariffs on India that will do a lot of damage to the Indian economy. So if you want to learn more about the improving relations between China and India, I will link to that other video in the description below. And US President Trump was obviously very angry about this successful meeting in Beijing. I can't help but think that Trump was also mad because the Chinese military showed much more discipline in its march than the disastrous so-called march that Trump tried to hold in Washington. I mean, the US military showed itself to be completely unprofessional, completely disorganized. But regardless, Trump was obviously very angry that all of these leaders from the Global South convened in Beijing to celebrate this anniversary, and Trump posted a furious message on his Twitter copy website, Truth Social, in which he demanded that China should be grateful for the US support provided to China in World War II. And then he also wrote, quote, "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America," end quote. So this is how in Washington they perceived this event. It's very clear which side actually feels pretty weak, despite the fact that Trump loves to talk about how strong and powerful the US empire is. It's obvious that he feels very insecure and troubled about this growing partnership, not only between China and Russia, but also among China, Russia, and North Korea, and many other global South countries that are tired of Western hegemony. They're tired of the Western imperial powers that colonized most of the world, trying to impose their will on the rest of the world. In fact, Trump basically admitted that his strategy to divide China, Russia, and India has failed. In a post on his Twitter copy website, Truth Social, Trump posted a photo of Xi with Putin and Modi, and he said, quote, "Looks like we've lost India and Russia to deepest, darkest China." Now, this post is very strange. He's referring to China like a villain in a Hollywood movie, deepest, darkest China. And it makes it clear that the US sees China as its mortal enemy. But what's even crazier about it is that an official White House account on Twitter, which is called Rapid Response 47, this official White House account published the post that Trump wrote, which shows how angry the US government is, how angry Trump is personally. But today I want to talk about the very close relations between Russia and China and how the Trump administration has completely failed to divide these two very important countries that are at the heart of this attempt to build a more multipolar world and challenge Western imperial hegemony. So first, I'm going to look at the diplomatic readout that was published by the Kremlin that summarizes the main points of the talks that were held between Putin and Xi on the 2nd of September. This readout said that Xi and Putin discussed, quote, further strengthening and promoting the comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction between Russia and China, end quote. They discussed many areas of cooperation, including healthcare, agriculture, nuclear energy, even a spacecraft mission. They also talked about how Russia and China can work together to advance education and science, jointly working on research projects. President Xi opened his remarks by referring to Putin as his longtime friend, and he emphasized that the close relations between China and Russia are not necessarily new in history, but in fact, you can go back to the 1930s and 40s when China and Russia were working together to fight against fascism and imperialism. And in China, they referred to World War II as the World Anti-Fascist War because, of course, in the European theater, they were also fighting against German fascism and Italian fascism, and China was fighting against Japanese fascism. And President Xi highlighted the, quote, great responsibility of China and Russia as the main victorious countries in World War II, end quote. China and the Soviet Union contributed by far the most to the defeat of fascism and imperialism in World War II. More than 26 million Soviets died in the war, and up to 20 million Chinese also died in the war. And yet in the West, many students are not taught about the heroic sacrifice made by the peoples of the USSR and China. And in his speech, President Xi emphasized that, quote, Chinese-Russian relations have withstood the test of the international climate and stand as a model of interstate relations, good neighborliness, friendship, comprehensive strategic partnership, mutually beneficial cooperation, and shared success, end quote. President Putin also began his remarks referring to Xi as his dear friend, and he emphasized the, quote, strategic nature of Russian-Chinese ties, which have reached an unprecedented level, end quote. That's a very important quote, an unprecedented level, according to Putin. And then he talked about the symbolic importance of the 80th anniversary of the defeat of fascism in World War II, which again was first celebrated in Moscow in May and then in Beijing in September. And Putin said that, quote, our decision to jointly celebrate the anniversary of the great victory in Moscow and Beijing is a tribute to the heroism of our nations, the people of Russia and China during World War II, a reaffirmation of the key role our countries played in the European and Asian theaters of war, and a testament to our shared commitment to defending historical truth and justice, end quote. And then Putin emphasized how the close relations between China and Russia today have their roots going back many decades. Of course, there was the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s and 70s, which for obvious reasons they don't want to discuss. But if you go back to the 1930s, the Soviet Union did provide support to China as it was fighting against the Japanese invaders. For the people of China, World War II began before it did in Europe, when Japan invaded China and colonized numerous parts of China. And the people of China fought back with support from the Soviet Union in the 1930s going into the 1940s. So this is a very important quote from Putin, who links that history to the situation today. Putin said, quote, we vividly remember our cooperation in the 1930s and in 1945, the memory of our combat brotherhood of trust, mutual assistance, and our resolute protection of our common interests laid the groundwork for the comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation between Russia and China in the new era. We stood together then, and we stand together now, end quote. So if you're sitting in Washington and you hear those words, it is very clear that Trump has failed and will continue to fail to divide Russia and China. Their partnership goes much deeper. It has its roots going back decades. The U.S. has failed, period. Now, I also want to briefly look at an interview that Putin did with the Chinese state media outlet Xinhua. The interview is titled, Russia and China to Continue Working Together for Prosperity. Putin discussed the growing economic relations between Russia and China, and he said they have, quote, reached an unprecedented level, end quote. He noted that China is by far Russia's top trading partner, and, this is very important, on the issue of de-dollarization, Putin stressed that nearly all of the transactions between Russia and China are being carried out in rubles and yuan, referring to the national currencies of Russia and China. China's currency is also known as the renminbi. So Putin is saying that they have de-dollarized their trade. They're no longer using dollars and euros in their trade. They're using their own currencies. Moreover, Putin discussed some of the investment that's going on in both of the two countries. For instance, there is now production happening inside Russia for Chinese cars and household appliances, and they're working together to build high-tech manufacturing and infrastructure facilities, and they have large-scale plans in the construction materials industry. Putin also discussed energy. He emphasized how Russia firmly retains its position as a leading exporter of oil and gas to China, and he noted that in 2027 they plan to launch another major gas route, the so-called Far Eastern gas route, and Putin talked about an existing pipeline which is known as the Power of Siberia 1 pipeline, which connects Russia's eastern region to northern China, and then it connects to a series of Chinese pipelines going down to Shanghai. However, although Putin didn't mention this in his interview, Russia and China signed another very important agreement while Putin was visiting Beijing, and this includes plans to build a Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. This is absolutely historic because plans for this pipeline have been discussed for many years now, but it was not known if it will actually be launched. And now there are many reports that this is going to happen. Power of Siberia 2 will connect the pipeline systems in Western Russia to Eastern Russia to the Siberian region. And then that network will also connect to Power of Siberia 1 and will go into China. And this is very significant because this now means that China will be getting natural gas from the Yamal fields, from Russia's Yamal Peninsula in the north of the country. And previously, this gas had gone to Europe on the so-called Yamal Europe pipeline. But of course, because of the proxy war in Ukraine and the European sanctions on Russia, Europe is now trying to boycott not only Russian oil, but also Russian gas. So instead of selling that cheap pipeline gas to Europe, Russia is now going to redirect that gas to China on the new Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. This is a major development, and it's a symbol of how Russia sees that its economic future lies in deepening integration with China and Asia as a whole. So Russia continues to look east and south. It's no longer looking to the west. Moscow has clearly made the decision to deepen integration in Eurasia and not with Europe, and certainly not with the United States. In fact, Putin talked more about the importance of Eurasian integration in the interview that he did with the Chinese media outlet Xinhua. He talked about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit that was held in the Chinese city of Tianjin. And Putin said that this meeting will give the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, quote, powerful new momentum and strengthen its capacity and consolidate solidarity across our shared Eurasian space to shape a fairer, multipolar world order. And in the same vein, Putin also talked about the importance of BRICS and how it is fighting back against Western neocolonialism. Putin used the term neocolonialism. This is quite new for the Russian leader. In the past few years, his rhetoric has become more openly anti-colonial as he emphasizes the importance of Russia integrating with Eurasia and the larger global South and no longer worrying about trying to get the West to accept Russia. We are in increasingly a post-Western world. And in this interview, Putin said, quote, we are working closely with China within BRICS to expand its role as a key pillar of the global architecture. Together, we advance initiatives aimed at expanding economic opportunities for member states, end quote. And of course, this includes using local currencies, not the US dollar, so countries of the global South can have more economic sovereignty and no longer need to rely on the US currency. Putin talked about how they're working together on critical infrastructure projects, and they are taking a, quote, common stand against discriminatory sanctions that hinder the economic development of our members in the world at large, end quote. And on this note, Putin called for reforming the global financial architecture and challenging neocolonialism. He said that China and Russia, quote, support the reform of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, end quote. The IMF and the World Bank are based in Washington. The US is the only country with veto power in these organizations. Putin emphasized that the world needs a, quote, new financial system that must be based on openness and true equity, providing equal and non-discriminatory access to its tools for all countries and reflecting the real standing of member states in the global economy. And then Putin added, quote, It is essential to end the use of finance as an instrument of neocolonialism, which runs counter to the interests of the global majority, end quote. This is a very important statement because what Putin is saying indirectly, but pretty clearly, is that the IMF and the World Bank, these existing financial institutions that are dominated by the US and the broader West, they are used as tools of neocolonialism. And the global South, which represents the global majority, want an alternative, demand an alternative, and they are building that alternative through these new organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and like BRICS. And this is why Russia is deepening its partnership with many other global South countries, not just China. So for instance, when Putin was visiting Beijing, he also held a series of important meetings with other leaders, including Kim Jong-un, the leader of the DPRK, North Korea, which is quite symbolic because Russia and the DPRK also now have a military agreement, a partnership, and they're expanding cooperation in other areas. Putin also met with the president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, which is symbolic as well because Russia is deepening its partnership with Iran after the US and Israel waged war on Iran, an illegal war of aggression that was condemned by Russia and China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They condemned that very clearly in the Tianjin Declaration. Putin also met with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, which is quite symbolic. You know, Turkey constantly plays both sides. So Turkey is a member of NATO, but it's also a dialogue partner in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and it was offered an invitation to join BRICS, although Turkey has not officially accepted the invitation. So it's constantly playing both sides to serve its own interests. But in the past few years, especially with the war in Ukraine, Turkey and Russia have grown closer together, and Turkey has become a major trading partner of Russia. Symbolically, Putin also held meetings in China with both the president of Vietnam and also the prime minister of Vietnam. And Russia and Vietnam have long had close relations going back to the Soviet Union, but still today, Russia and Vietnam have very close ties and they're deepening their partnership. And in fact, Vietnam is now part of BRICS. While the US was waging war on Iran in June, Vietnam quietly announced that it had accepted the offer to become a partner country in BRICS. So this is not just about Russia and China. This is about a larger multipolar project in which more and more countries across the global South are coming together to create alternatives, to build a post-Western world in which all countries, the countries of the global South that were colonized by the West, they all have an equal voice. They're not treated as neo-colonies like the US treats countries of Latin America today, violating their sovereignty, threatening war on Venezuela, backing coup attempts. More and more countries are coming together in organizations like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they're saying, we refuse to accept this neo-colonial order dominated by the West, with the United States on top, trying to impose its hegemony on the rest of the world. The global majority is not accepting that. And at the heart of this multipolar project is, of course, China and Russia and that deep partnership. But it's not just about them. And if you want to learn more about these very significant changes that are happening in the world today, make sure that you subscribe to our work here at Geopolitical Economy Report. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time. Thanks a lot for joining us today.